All right, welcome to our AAA astrophotography meetup on January 29th. We're going to talk about photographing a total solar eclipse. The April 8th eclipse is coming up, and I think a lot of people are interested in both seeing it and also photographing it. And what we'll talk about today really is about photographing the total eclipse, but also a lot of this will apply if you don't make it to the path of totality and you're just in the area where there's a partial eclipse. If you stay here in New York City, I think the sun is about 89 to 90% covered. So that's still a pretty good eclipse, pretty deep eclipse, and you can get some pretty decent pictures from that. I'll just talk about things that I've learned over the years of photographing eclipse. I've been to 3 total solar eclipses, which I think is a pretty small number by a lot of people's standards. And for all the photography that I do, including the eclipses, I just try to make a simple approach that I can, as simple as possible, because you're really going to want to watch the eclipse. For a lot of people, it could be a once in a lifetime event. In any case, it's such an awesome thing to see that you don't want to be spending the time trying to adjust your camera, fiddling around with controls or lenses or anything like that. You want to be able to really look up at the sky, look at the corona, look around, you see what's happening. There's going to be a lot of stuff to take in, and the simpler your setup is, the better pictures you'll get, but the more time that you'll have to actually experience the eclipse, which to me is the most important thing. That photography should be the secondary thing. That really experiencing the eclipse, especially if you've never seen a total eclipse, you really want to kind of take in everything, and there really will be a lot of things as the veteran eclipse watchers will tell you. So let me share my screen here. And a couple of things before we get started. If you get some really good pictures, both of the eclipse, but also of just general astrophotography, night sky landscapes or deep sky objects, and you post them on Instagram, remember that the AAA has 2 Instagram accounts, AAA NY _ astrophotography. That's dedicated just to the astrophotography group. And then also AAA.org, and that's the general club Instagram. So tag one or both of those entities when you're on Instagram, and we'll try to repost those. Like I said, an eclipse is just like an amazing experience, and you really want to be able to spend your time watching it, looking at it, because you can look at it with your naked eyes during totality, and just take in the whole experience rather than really spending a lot of time on your camera. I think the group here knows that you really got to have a pair of safe solar eclipse glasses to view the partial phases before and after totality, and especially if you're in an area where it's just a partial eclipse, and look for the ISO numbers on the side of the glasses that'll certify that they're safe, where you can directly look at the sun through the glasses, and so you want to make sure that your eyes are protected. So what kind of I'll talk a little bit about like lenses, exposures, things like that. So what kind of lenses do you use? And a lot of it depends on what kind of picture you want. I think a lot of people like the telephoto view. This is a cropped version of this picture that I took with a 500 millimeter in the eclipse in 2019 in Chile. But really, if you've got like a telephoto zoom, any kind of telephoto would work pretty well. I did this little exercise. These are all sized to the image, the size they would get for different focal lengths. And so anywhere, even if you have a 200, 300 millimeter lens, you'll get a very decent picture of the eclipse. Don't go out and buy a really long telephoto lens or a telescope if you're not going to really use it after the eclipse. And also, it's something that really takes get used to using. And so if you already don't have a pretty long telephoto lens, it's best to stick with the equipment that you have, the equipment that you know, because you'll need to do a fair amount of practicing anyway if you're not used to doing solar photography, and just to get knowing where your equipment is, because you really want to know the camera, the lens, your tripod, all the equipment in pretty well, so that when the eclipse comes, you'll be able to make the couple of different settings, and then spend your time really concentrating on the eclipse. Let's see. Another way to go about is with wide angle lenses. So this was taken with an 18 millimeter on a full frame camera. And also I've done next couple of pictures are composites, where I've taken a whole series of pictures during the partial phases before and after the total eclipse, and then combine them together in this composite showing the path of the eclipse across the sky. So a wide angle lens works really well, because it's what it does, it shows you the location that you're in. It puts it really in perspective. It's like what Dan and I were talking about before we started the session, is that it really puts you in a location. It doesn't telephoto will isolate the sun and the moon for the eclipse. A wide angle will show you really where you're located, and that can make a very quite a dramatic picture. The way that I put together these different composites is kind of similar to what you do with star trails. It's just a whole sequence of images that are combined together, showing the path of the eclipse. So this is a 32 millimeter lens, which was I'm using a zoom lens. So I picked the focal length that sort of fit where the sun was going to be during this eclipse in Chile. So you get the idea of the relative size of the sun in the frame. It's big enough where you could tell that it's a total eclipse, but it's not so small that you won't be able to tell what it is. And this is in 2015, and so this is I used a 24 millimeter lens, but this image has been cropped, so it's equivalent to maybe about a 30 millimeter lens, somewhere there. So you kind of get the idea that you can kind of show a bigger area and really see the surroundings that you're in. So there's actually different images that you get, whether using a telephoto or a wide angle lens. So the partial phase is what everybody will see no matter where they are. The started eclipse up to totality, and then after the eclipse becomes total, there'll be sort of the moon will be receding off the face of the sun. And so if you're in the path of totality, you'll also see and be able to photograph it's called the diamond ring effect. You get this very small sliver of the sun producing this very bright area, and then what's also called Bailey's beads, which are the little tiny bits of light that come through where the moon's mountains and craters, where the sun shines through there, and that's right at what's called second contact. And then once the moon covers the face of the sun, and then you get totality on the right side. For whether you're going to be in the path of totality, especially if you're going to be just shooting the partial eclipse, you're going to need a safe solar filter for your camera. And there's a few companies that make filters, especially for telescopes. Thousand Oaks Optical is one of them, and they produce something called a solar light filter sheets. And they have a second line of essentially sheets. It's a dark polymer that's safe for optical use in telescopes, so it'll protect against the UVA, UVB rays, and the infrared rays. And so this is the most inexpensive and probably the easiest way to go about getting a filter. If you don't have a solar filter now yet for your camera, I know probably a large part of this group already has solar filters for their cameras or telescopes. But if you don't have one, try to order it as soon as you can, because the wait times are starting to get fairly long already. And in fact, I think I've been working with Adorama on doing a workshop like this, and I noticed that their Botter filters are on back order already. So you might be aware, you might want to keep that in mind and try to order as soon as you can. Thousand Oaks also makes these filters in a aluminum housing like this with the same material, the solar light material, and those fit on the very front of your telescope or lens, and then you could order a specific diameter for the diameter of your lens. And those are pretty handy. They're already in a filter holder. Botter is another company that's specifically for astronomy use, and so that they'll make both what they call astrosolar safety film, which is a sheet of it looks like plastic that's either silvered or black on one side or both sides, and also they make the pre-made filter holders that you could put on the front of your lenses. Let's see. Preston, I'm wondering if you could check the chat. I can't really see the chat when I'm in the speaking mode here. And if there are any questions, if you could pass those along, that would be great. Oh, Preston, sorry, you're muted. You're muted, Preston.
Yeah, Dan says that Amazon has Thousand Oaks sheets in stock, and he just purchased it the other day. I might also recommend the Quaker Oats mount, which I took the Quaker Oats mount or top of a Quaker Oats box and just put the Thousand Oaks emulsion in it, staple it in 3 places with some gaff tape, and that works pretty good too.
That's great, and it's a healthy breakfast as well.
There you go. Eating healthy and looking healthy.
You're looking good, Preston. If you buy the sheets, it's very easy just to attach to your lens. What I do is cut a size a little bit bigger than the diameter of the lens, and on the corners I'll put some gaffer tape and tape those to the lens. Make sure that the tape is secure enough that it doesn't blow off if wind comes by. But this is basically the most basic and the cheapest way to attach the film filters to your lens. And then the good thing about things like the Thousand Oaks and the Botter, they come in sheets, usually about 8 by 11 or 12 by 12. You can cut 1 or 2 for your lenses that you have, and then you'll have spares for either other eclipses or people around you that might not have the eclipses, the filters. So you have plenty of spares to go around.
You can put them on binoculars too.
Yes, these can go on binoculars. What I did was, thanks to Ed Rojas, he showed us this contraption that he hand built a few years ago before the 2017 eclipse. So I copied his idea, and out of foam core, I made a filter holder where I could attach it to the front of both either a telephoto or a wide-angle lens, and the filter just drops down I could drop it down during totality, and it's still on the camera. It's still there. End of totality, I put the flap up, and then I just put a piece of tape to hold it in there, and then I can shoot the rest of the eclipse. So I don't need to remove the filter completely from the lens and find a place to put it. I know that it's always there on the front of the lens, and so for me this works pretty well. I just took a few pieces of black foam core and cut it to the size. On the back part is I cut a piece the circumference of the lens, and then used a roll of black gaffer tape to attach it to the back of there. So I attached that and also taped that to the front of the lens, so it's fairly secure.
Stan, can I ask you a question?
Oh, sure.
On the Thousand Oaks, I'm wondering, do you have to be really careful about thumbprints on that kind of stuff? It doesn't seem like it, but I don't know what your opinion is.
Not really. What they do recommend, though, is that I think a lot of people's their inclination is to stretch it tight over the lens so that there are no ripples or anything like that. And they said no, don't do that, because that actually might affect the focus. So if you just tape it on, that's perfectly good. A lot of people, I think, have seen this picture and they say, well, it looks all
right.
The front looks uneven, and according to both Thousand Oaks and Botter, that really doesn't matter, and the pictures that have taken both of the eclipses and just solar pictures. The pictures are fine, the focusing is fine, and so I think it's good to keep it clean like anything else, and that they're cheap enough where if you do get a lot of thumbprints or handle the front of it a lot, you could just cut another sheet and then put a new sheet on the front of your lens.
Do you think Windex would hurt it?
Um, I'm not sure. I don't think so. You probably don't really need to clean it unless it shows up in your pictures.
Right.
If you take a picture and the part of the sun might look a little fuzzy, then the easiest way is just to replace the filter. It's relatively cheap. Are there any more? Are there some questions that came up?
No, I'm seeing no questions.
Okay, good. The difference between the two filters, the Bader produces a neutral white image of the sun, and the Thousand Oaks produce an orange image of the sun. That's why the partial eclipse pictures that I'll show you are through the Thousand Oaks filter, and that's why they're this orangish color. I kind of like the orangish color. It sort of looks like what you think the sun would look like. Technically, though, the white is the more accurate version. That's the sun it produces white light, and it's just white. Let's see. Oh, so if you're using a telephoto lens, especially a non-zoom lens, it might be a little bit hard to point it at the sun a lot. This Teleview, they call it a soul searcher. You just attach this on either the body of it's made for the body of a telescope. You could just Velcro it also to a lens, or even tape it on the body of a lens, and you just align the sunlight comes through here, and you see the circle of the sun on this little white circle there. And once you see the circle outline of the sun, then your lens or telescope is pointed directly at the sun, and that would help you point it.
If I could just jump in, if you're using a zoom lens, obviously you zoom all the way out, so you have the widest field.
Right.
And then look at the back of your camera at the at the monitor there, and you could just almost just point it until you see the sun, and center it, and then you zoom in, and that's an easy way to do it.
Right, and then don't focus until you've zoomed to the focal length you're going to use, because you need to focus at the focal length that you're going to be using. If you're not going to be using a telescope tracking mount or don't want to travel with one, what I use for a lot of my both the night sky work, but also for eclipses, is a geared head. And I bought this Benro geared head last year, and it's worked out pretty well. What it does, it's similar to a pan tilt head, but it's locked in the position until you move the dials. These three control the three different axes, and for an eclipse, the sun, of course, is moving in azimuth, left to right, and it's also moving in altitude. So there's only two of these knobs that you need to turn. Is the one that moves your camera left or right, probably to the right, and then the one that moves it up or down. You'll be moving it up a little bit. So you could easily follow the sun throughout the eclipse with the geared head. To me, a ball head is small, easy to travel with, but especially with a telephoto lens, it's kind of a nightmare, because once you unlock the ball, then all of a sudden your lens is wobbling around, and you really find it difficult to try to get the sun back into the frame. So I recommend a geared head like this, because it's quite easy to use. It's easy. It's a little heavy to travel with, but it's definitely worth it, especially if you're not using any kind of a tracking mount.
Stan, would you try to polar align that?
Well, this you don't polar align. This is a geared head. It's just a tripod head.
Okay.
If you were using a telescope mount or a tracking mount, you would really need to polar align it as closely as you can during the daytime, or do it overnight, and then you'd have to leave your setup there, at least the mount setup. But that's the way you do it if you were doing using actually a tracking mount. let's see. So the sun, especially, I'll toward the end of the talk, I'll show you why you wouldn't want to use a really long focal length lens or telescope. I think a lot of people wanted to try to use very long focal lengths during the annular eclipse in October, and this is with a 600 millimeter lens during the 2017 eclipse, and this is basically a contact sheet through of my images, and I had set a timer so that I took a picture every 1 minute. The aim that I was going to do was I would take a selection of these pictures and do a composite of a telephoto composite of the eclipse. And so I shot one every minute. So every minute, this is how fast the sun is moving through the frame. And so in 7 minutes, it's almost out of the frame. And I convinced my wife to help me, and she was working the geared head as I was paying attention to my other camera. And so as the image of the sun got up toward the top, then she would move essentially just move it to the right and then move it up a little bit. So then now the sun is down in the far left-hand corner, and it starts it again. So every 7 minutes, my wife had to make this movement of the geared head. So the longer the focal length you have, the faster the sun is going to be moving through that field of view. And so if you if you're interested in trying to photograph the corona of the sun, then you don't want a super long focal length either, because you run the danger of actually cutting off some of the corona. And so you could for some of the partial stuff, you could crop into your picture fairly easily, and it's just I think it's just a matter of how comfortable you are with moving a telephoto lens around. So I would recommend something more in the 500 to 550 millimeter range for this eclipse. The composite I was telling you about looks like this. So I just took, I think this is the sun the sun and the moon every 20 minutes or so. So I put a few 4 on each side during the partial phases, and then the total eclipse photo in the center. And this is a lot of things that you could practice before the eclipse. The great thing about a solar eclipse is that it happens during the daytime, so you don't have to stay up really late at night. But also you could practice all of this thing with the equipment, with the filters, with whatever lens you're going to use, and then get to know your equipment really well. That's really one of the keys. You don't want to be buying a piece of equipment in the middle of March either for the April 8th eclipse. You want whatever you think you're going to bring, have it with you now, so that you can go out. If we ever see the sun, which we haven't seen for a few days, go out, set your equipment up, put the filters on, try to get the sun in the viewfinder. Do all this practicing beforehand so that it makes sense for you when you get there. And then my advice, especially if you've never seen a total solar eclipse, is to choose one type of picture, either the telephoto or the wide angle. Especially if you've never used if you do have two cameras and you've never used two cameras to shoot an event like this, don't start on April 8th, because it's really a recipe for disaster. What'll happen is that you'll want to try to get pictures from both cameras. You'll be fiddling around with the cameras, and even if you're in the 4.5 minutes of totality, it sounds like a long time, but it's going to go by extremely fast. And so you really want to be able to have a setup where you could kind of leave it alone and you could enjoy and watch the eclipse. So try to make it as simple as possible. I think I saw Preston waving his hand.
Yeah, Stan, Rory asks, is it safe to view totality through a telescope by removing the filter and then putting it back after?
Yeah, just through totality. I mean, I people that I was with for one of the eclipses were using binoculars, and I think they say it's pretty spectacular view. Again, if you have to make sure your focal length isn't too long, or if you've got a tracking mount, I think that helps. But I think that's supposed to be a fairly spectacular view of just watching totality through a telescope.
And Ben asks, were there many promises on this particular eclipse?
Many what?
Solar promises.
Well, we don't know. We're not going to know until April 8th.
No, on the one we're seeing on the screen now, the 2017.
Oh, I see. Yeah, if you zoomed into this, there's a few on this side, and I think toward the top. It's harder to see in this view just because the image itself is smaller.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
So let's go to exposure. And a lot of it, I mean, I could give you, I'll recommend a starting point, but a lot of it depends on a lot of factors. What's the atmosphere like? Are there some clouds, thin clouds? Is there smoke, haze? A lot of it depends on the equipment that you have. Your camera and lens and filter are different than my camera and lens and filter. So there's a lot of these factors. And that's why I say go out and practice, put all your equipment together, and find a baseline setting for your setup. The best approach is really to shoot on the manual exposure settings because even if you start out at a good starting point, if you're in the auto setting with the filter on, the light meter in the camera will get all messed up and it won't be able to determine a correct exposure for the sun. If you have it set on manual, that setting won't change until you change it, and so you'll get much more consistent results. As long as the sky is clear, there are no clouds, and you have a good view of the sun through all the partial phases before and after totality, the exposure really shouldn't change. You shouldn't need to change the exposure at all. So you're set there. The starting point that I use when I go out and I do maybe want to take some pictures of the sun with sunspots, I start at ISO 400, a thousandth of a second at f8, and that's with the solar filter on. That's with the 1000 Oaks optical filter on my lens. So I'll start at that setting, and then I'll take a few pictures, or I also use the spot meter setting in the metering mode on my camera. Virtually every camera now has a spot meter mode, and that just measures a very, very small portion of the entire frame, the focus point. That's where it will measure the light, and you can actually put, especially with a telephoto, you could put that onto the sun and just determine the exposure that way. But I'll generally start at this setting, and then I'll just adjust it from there, just depending on the conditions around me, whether there are any clouds or anything like that. And also shoot in the raw setting. There's really no need to shoot JPEGs anymore. Shoot in RAW because you'll have a lot more control over the image once you get it into your computer, once you're doing the image processing, and you'll have that full information that will help you make any adjustments if you need to.
Stan, when you say during totality, it means without filter, right?
During totality, you need to take the filter off your camera, and I'll show a demonstration of that coming up. But as long as the moon is not covering the sun during the partial phases, you need to have the filter on your camera.
Okay.
And so once you get during totality, you have to increase the exposure because the corona is just not as bright as the face of the sun. And so I'll do a little demonstration about that. And you'll have to increase the exposure by about 4 to 6 f-stops worth of exposure. So in other words, like 4 to 6 of the major shutter speed settings. And I'll show you that in a little bit. The easiest way is to have your camera on a tripod. It should be on a tripod anyway, just because that stabilizes everything. It keeps it in one place, and you don't have to worry about holding your camera as you're changing the settings. It's right in front of you. You just lower the shutter speed. Keep everything else the same. You lower the shutter speed from, if you're shooting at a thousandth of a second, down to a 30th or 15th of a second in one f-stop increments. And then you could shoot a couple frames at each interval, or you could just go all the way down to a 30th or a 15th of a second and shoot as many as you can during the total, when it's total. And also use a remote trigger, because that way your camera's a little bit more stable, as if you were shooting at night. The other reason to use a remote trigger is that you could be pressing the button on your remote trigger and looking up at the eclipse at the same time. So you could be enjoying the eclipse, you're pressing the trigger, your camera's doing all the work, and you're enjoying the eclipse. So that's another reason to have a separate a wireless remote trigger, or it just needs to be something simple, something that'll fire the shutter. So here's a demonstration of the filter being on and off. All these pictures were taken with at the same camera setting. So I was using a ISO 400, started out at 400. I was using 1/500th at f11. That was my setting for the 2017 eclipse. And so these are the images of the sun and the moon 1 minute apart. And then when the sun gets to a very, very thin crescent, a very thin sliver, especially if we're with a group of people, someone's going to yell, "Filters off." And so at that moment, you take the filter off, don't change the camera setting, keep it at the exact same setting, and just keep shooting, because you'll get this diamond ring effect and that'll slowly go away. I'm not sure what the interval between, I might be shooting a picture every second or every couple seconds here. So the moon is now almost covering the face of the sun. So as long as you keep shooting, you'll get the diamond ring effect, and then you'll get Bailey's beads, things like that. But don't change the camera setting. This part is fairly simple. You just go, keep it at the same, take the filter off, keep shooting pictures. You'll still need to keep the solar glasses on until the entire corona appears. But you could shoot a lot of pictures here, and you can get a series of pictures during this particular portion as the moon goes into the second continent. So here are the sort of the different settings that I was using. I showed you this picture before. During the partial phase, as you can see, the ISO, the shutter speed, the ISO and the f-stop are the same for all three of these pictures. The only difference is right here during totality. This particular frame is I shot at 1/15th of a second. So I changed just the shutter speed. You keep the other two the same, and that simplifies that. So the only thing you have to think about now is really the shutter speed. You don't have to worry about changing the ISO. You don't have to worry about changing the f-stop, because you don't really want to. You only want to be changing one thing at a time. Otherwise, there'll be a lot of, there's just too much to think about. You want to think about the very least number of things dealing with your camera, at least during the eclipse, because that'll just make your experience a lot more enjoyable.
Stan, Gowrie asked, what is the interval of various eclipse phases in your composite pic? He says, I like the symmetry and looks laterally equivalent.
Oh, and the one that Gary, you're talking about the one, the telephoto one that I showed you just a few slides ago?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, I think that's about every 20 minutes there. The wider angle ones are about 5 minutes apart. I chose a frame about every 5 minutes apart to line up, and the telephoto was about 20 minutes apart, because I didn't want to put too many into that composite.
And also in the chat, Victor Madera gives a link to B&H for some filters.
Yes, both B&H and Adorama carry filters. One warning that I forgot to tell you: be very, very careful and don't buy a neutral density filter for photographic use to use for the solar eclipse, because none of the neutral density filters that I've seen are protect against UV and infrared rays. So they're dangerous if somebody picks them up and tries to look at them through the sun, thinking that they're safe. They're quite dangerous, and so I'm going to be doing a workshop in the Adorama store toward the end of February about how to shoot a solar eclipse, and we had done a video call last week, and I actually pointed that out to them. They had no idea, so I'm not sure what they're going to do, because I said a lot of these, the Hoya and the Nisi filters, are labeled as solar filters, and to me that's very misleading, and it could be could be quite dangerous, because especially if you're using it with a DSLR, you are looking through the lens of the camera, and so that could be dangerous for your eyes. So there are plenty of filters. Thousand Oaks, Botter, and Celestron make solar filters for telescopes and lenses. Plenty of very safe filters out there that people use for visual observing, and I would definitely stick with those. Once you have your filter, oh, sorry, private person.
I'm just going to say, Rocco was asking, Stan, when are you shooting a wider frame? How are you exposing the foreground, or is it a composite done in Photoshop later?
Well, I assemble all of the individual frames in Photoshop. It's essentially like creating a star trail. You just put a whole sequence of images together. The foreground in the wide angle pictures, that exposure comes from just the longer exposure. It's actually more, the settings that I have, it was more like a quarter to a half a second exposure during totality, just like the telephoto lenses. And so I just get a lot more of the foreground in the picture, and plus the filter is not on the camera, so that the foreground and the image of the sun in totality is one frame, and then the suns, the various partially eclipsed suns, are the rest of the frames taken through the solar filter. I think Giselle, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I would theoretically want to use my Sigma 150 to 600 millimeter lens for this. What would, other than making it, which I'm open to doing it, but I'd still need an actual filter. Should I use on the front of my camera lens?
Oh, you should use the either the Thousand Oaks or the Botter filters. If you could buy the filter sheets that they have, and that's relatively inexpensive and easy. And you could just tape that to the front of your lens if you want, or you can make use an oatmeal cap, just like Preston, or you can make the little device that I made. But you definitely need to have something to be able to attach the filter to the front of your lens.
Okay, and
I have the
which sheet would I
that lens.
choose? Sorry, because I see I'm on the Thousand Oaks side, and they have like silver black and solar light.
The solar light is good because the one side of it is silver, so it seems to reflect the heat a little bit better, and it's not that much more expensive, and it's quite a safe filter. I ordered a bunch of those a few months ago.
So I was going to say I have that lens and the Thousand Oaks. I think it's a 4-inch, and it's a little bigger than the lens, but I put 2 little pads. You know those felt pads, the sticky sides. So I put them on both sides, so it fits perfectly and slides in and out very easily. So I recommend that.
If you can find the link to it, can you put it in the chat, please?
Yes, yeah.
I'll try.
Yeah, if you go to the Thousand Oaks site and you just go to, it's either the solar light or solar filters, then they'll show you the filter holders, essentially, that George is talking about, that they pre-made out of aluminum, and then they put attach the filter in there. And there's a guide on there that shows you how to measure the diameter of your lens, and then you just order that size, and it should fit the outer diameter of your lens.
Stan, there's a couple more things here. George H said you would need at least a neutral density 4.5 filter to protect against eye damage in the partial phases, and ND3 filter. And ND3 filter does block UV and IR, but it is not dark enough. And ND1 filter, for some reason, does not block UV and IR. Well, this thing's popping around as I'm trying to read it.
Sure.
It's not very blah, blah, blah. So you cannot just put together an ND3 and 2 ND1s to get an ND5. Okay, and ND3 plus a Herschel wedge is enough. Better to just buy a real solar filter. And Ken says the reason that gelatin neutral density filters are dangerous is that they are made with dyes. And dyes do not filter out the infrared and UV, which is what damages your eye. Do not use gelatin filters or glass neutral density filters because the glass filters also get their neutral density from dyes.
Yeah,
Thank
the
you.
the real moral of the story is just don't buy neutral density filters for photographic use, because even neutral density filters are not don't protect against UV radiation. And the Hoya and Nisi descriptions of the products, in the actual product description, it says these filters should not be used for visual observing through lenses or telescopes. So they, even though they promote them as solar filters, they actually say that in the fine print of their product description. Let's see. I think Dan M had a hand up.
Yeah. Hey, Stan. I just wanted to add, I'm sorry if you added this already, but just so people know, I mean, you really do need a solar filter, even if you don't plan on taking a single picture of the partial phases, because you want to make sure you're in perfect focus right before totality. And the only way to ensure that is by focusing on the crescent right before totality. So you need to have a filter in front of the lens to do that.
Yes, that's right. I was going to just talk about focusing. And Marcelo? Hi, Marcelo.
Hi. I was just going to ask a question. I heard all this discussion not to use the neutral density filters that are advertised for solar photography because somebody may use it to look through it. But if we have a lot of human viewable devices, the glasses, telescopes, and whatnot, but we do buy some of these solar filters that are neutral density filters, like 100,000 or 16 f-stops. Will they damage the camera like they will damage an eye, or it's just a precaution in case somebody were to look through it?
It wouldn't damage the camera. It's just a precaution in case somebody does think, oh, well, this is a solar filter, I can look through it. Or if you're using the neutral density filter on a DSLR, you're actually looking through the lens, so that the light is reaching your eyes, and so that could be dangerous.
Yeah, no, I was planning to buy, but they have something that looks actually really good, and it gives a very bright orange in image. It's on B&H. It's called the Nisi Solar Filter Pro Nano, whatever. It's in B&H. It's about $100. But in my case, all the cameras I have at this point, they're all DSLRs, but not. I mean, it's the, what do you call it? The new ones.
The mirrorless.
Mirrorless. So it's mirrorless. So even if we're to look through the viewfinder, is an optical viewfinder. So there is no chance somebody could damage their eyes. So I was thinking buying a few of these just for the cameras and put them permanently attached to the cameras. And they come with a magnetic ring. So when totality comes, you can just pop it up without fussing or unscrewing anything because it's magnetic.
That's fine. My advice is just, there's plenty of safe solar filters out there, and it's just as easy to buy a really good solar filter that's safe and that you could use it for anything. So that's just what I think people should be doing. I mean, as long as you're careful, that's fine. But there's other people that might not be as careful, and so that's the real danger. We were speaking of focusing, when you after you put your filter on, with a telephoto lens, you should always put the filter on first before you aim at the sun, and then you could focus it. And you could easily use autofocus on the sun. It's bright enough, and there's enough contrast there. But what you want to do after you do focus on the sun is to either disable the autofocus, if you could do that in your camera, or put the lens and or the camera on the manual focus mode so that it's not focusing. Because what will happen is that the focus point in the middle of your viewfinder, the middle of the field, because the sun is moving, all of a sudden that focus point might be in the black area, and then there's nothing to focus on, and you'll get a nice fuzzy out of focus sun. And so this is again something to practice on when you're before the eclipse, is focusing and making sure you get that good focus. You take a picture, you zoom into the picture on the back of your camera, check to see that that is focused. The sun's fairly active now, so there'll be sunspots, and you could easily see if the sunspot is visible and in focus, and that's one way to see. And also the very edge of the sun. Obviously, if the very edge of the sun looks sharp and in focus, then you're pretty good. With the wide-angle lenses, sometimes it's hard to the sun might be fairly small, a little bit hard to focus on. But the easiest way to focus the wide-angle lens would be to focus on a very distant object, something on the horizon, mountains or landscape or buildings. And then put the filter on. Again, disable the autofocus, because if your camera tries to start focusing with the solar filter on, it's not going to be, the focus point will be in this black area, nothing to focus on. So you'll get a very nice out of focus picture. So another thing to practice on is like focusing your wide angle lens, putting the filter on, and then you're set for the eclipse. Let's see. This slide is just about exposure. So as I said, you can keep your camera setting the same for the partial phase. As it gets close to and at second contact, where you've got the diamond ring effect, the Bailey's beads, and as soon as it goes into totality, then you start slowing the shutter speed down until you get down to about 15th, 30th of a second, 15th of a second, and then you get a lot more of the corona. And then you got to do the reverse once the moon starts to slide off the face of the sun. Raise your shutter speed back to where it was, and then put on the filter so that your camera is safe. When you're doing if you're using the spot meter, I usually try to get a light meter reading that's essentially slightly overexposed. If there's a 0 point on your light meter scale, I'll go to the plus side, maybe a third, 2/3, sometimes almost one stop, because you don't want the sun kind of a darkish gray looking. You want it sort of bright looking, and more toward the brighter yellow side, and then and you could see that pretty easily on the back of your camera.
Stan, if you don't mind, I do want to say that the good news is you got plenty of time to practice this. And
yes.
One of the things I sort of made a mistake on, not a big mistake, but I started shooting the sun like an hour before sunset, and I would practice doing that. And then one day I decided to go up on a roof and try and catch it around the time that it would actually be like around, I don't know, 12:30, 1 o'clock. And it was different having the camera pointed straight up because now I got to get under to look at it. And now I got to, and the filter hangs differently. And that's the kind of stuff you don't want to discover when you're trying to shoot totality, or when the actual time comes. So I would say you can practice, but also try and practice at the time of the day you're going to be doing it, because it makes a difference. Right.
And we had some planning sessions, and I'll show you a couple websites after I talk about the photography. But it's easy to find out how high the sun is going to be, where you're going to be during the eclipse. All that we know all that right now, and so it's easy to go out. Probably the best thing to do is like Preston, if you can, go out around high noon, 1 o'clock. And that's when the sun is at the highest. It'll probably be fairly close to where it's going to be during the eclipse. And so you want to be able to use your equipment at that angle, not at sunset, as Preston found out that there is a big difference between the sun low on the horizon and the sun relatively, even if about 45 degrees is a big difference in terms of of how you're working with your equipment.
Yeah, I had to get my tripod a lot higher so I could get
Right.
under on my knees and know what that tripod had to look like in order to get it be in the optimal position to do the work.
Yeah, exactly. So this is something that I went a while ago. I was looking back through the pictures that I took during 2017, and I realized that one wide angle camera that I had set on a tripod, I had put on automatic exposure just to see what would happen. And so if you want to just shoot a wide angle picture and you have a tripod and a camera and a remote release, then if you have it on the one of the auto settings, it actually might work okay. So this is with I think this is with a 14mm lens on a full frame camera, so pretty wide view. But I'm also getting a lot of foreground. This is me. This is my wife. This is Aubrey Geminati. She's the NASA photographer that was with us, and we're in Madras, Oregon. And so this method actually seems to work. So what I did was I used the spot meter. I used it on aperture priority. So that means you set the aperture on your lens, the f-stop. You keep the ISO the same, and the camera will select the shutter speed. So when the eclipse started, the camera was shooting at about 2,000ths of a second because the sun was out. There was actually a few high. There were a little bit of smoke in our area from fires, from wildfires. But throughout the eclipse, the shutter speed slowed down more and more and more until this is during totality. It's shooting at 1 second, and that actually turned out to be pretty good. The actual frame is a little bit lighter than this. I darkened it slightly just to make it look like to my eyes when we were looking up at the sky. The autofocus is disabled. You don't want your camera to be focusing on anything at all. So I used the spot meter mode, and so I put a little red square here. This is about the position that I put the focusing spot where the spot meter was reading the light and determining the exposure. Most cameras, you can move around the focus position from, usually the default is in the middle, but you can also move it around to different parts of the frame. So I didn't want it to be anywhere near where the sun was, because that would affect the exposure. So I put it off to one side. It was essentially trying to expose for the sky. The sky got darker and darker. It needed more and more exposure. It needed a longer and longer shutter speed. And so this actually happened to work out. I might try this again because the exposure was pretty close. It was not far off, and I think you can get a good result. You don't have to look through the camera. You don't really have to change any shutter speeds. You just keep firing your camera, and you'll get a perfectly great wide angle picture of the sun, the people around you, the location that you're in. So this actually seems to work pretty good.
Here's another point here. Dan says, as the temperature drops significantly in the minutes leading up to and during totality, will it cause your focus to shift? Will you need to refocus very shortly before totality?
No, you might want to check about 5 to 10 minutes before totality, especially if you're using with a telephoto lens. With a wide angle, you don't need to check unless you just want to make sure that the camera is still on the focus. But check before totality. Do not try to focus during totality, because what will happen is that you'll make things worse, because there's the sun will be fully eclipsed. People will be going nuts. You'll be going nuts, and nothing good is going to happen at that. Before totality, you have your filter on. You could focus, make sure it's in focus. Either lock that focus, put it on manual, disable the autofocus, whatever you do to make the camera not focus, and then for the next few minutes, you'll be fine. It's not the temperature change is really not going to change anything, but it's something to also be aware of. This is why you want to be looking at the eclipse. You want to be experiencing it, because all of these things are going to be happening around you that you want to remember. You may or may not like the picture that you get, or you'll probably like it, you'll remember the eclipse a lot more than the picture that you took. You remember the experience rather. Jay, you've got your hand up, Jason.
Hey Stan, how you doing? Just
All right.
looking in that picture that you have posted right this second, what star do you know was up in the sky there?
Oh, I think, is that toward the top of the frame?
Yeah, right, like 12 o'clock from your red square.
I think that's Venus or Jupiter. One of the planets was in that region of the sky, and of course, as the sun darkened, it was pretty bright. And I'll show you later on. I think Regulus was right about here, and that showed up in a lot of the telephoto pictures because it's a relatively bright star, and of course the sky gets. It shows you how dark the sky gets during a total eclipse.
Yeah, when we on the 2017 eclipse, I had looked at what the star chart was going to be, so that when the stars were, when we got totality, I could understand where we were in the sky.
Oh yeah, that'd be great. Antoine.
Yeah. I was asking the question is, have you, beside that bright planet, have you been able to expose 4 stars and see stars, or it's only when you magnify on telephoto that you see them, but not on the wide shot?
Well, I think on this shot, if I zoomed in, there's something over here. There's a pretty bright one up there. You could probably see some. The sky is kind of a dark twilight. So it's essentially, if you went out a dark twilight and you started shooting 5-minute exposures, you'd get this white. You're right. Everything would be white, even in a dark sky site. So there's a point where you can't expose anymore because of the background light, and of course the horizon here would get blown out pretty quickly because it's still fairly bright. But that's
Okay.
I could have exposed this maybe for 2 seconds or 3 seconds, but then you lose the sun. The moon's, because of the overexposure, the moon starts to disappear, and then you lose that effect.
Okay, thanks.
So this aperture priority with a wide-angle lens is one option if you really want to keep it super simple and enjoy the eclipse, because then you don't have to worry about too much. But if you're back to the actual changing of the exposure, another method is to use what some cameras call it auto bracketing or bracketing. You bracket the shutter speed of your camera, and that will the way you can set it up so it'll just keep increasing the amount of exposure till you get to a point where you get a big corona. This works pretty well on both the wide angle and the telephoto, probably a little bit better with the telephoto lenses. So the way I set up my camera, you could pick the order of exposures, and that could vary from camera to camera. I pick it so that the way that the pictures show up in my camera and then eventually on my computer is it starts with the underexposed, the minus side. 0 is the middle or the center exposure, and plus is the overexposure side. So it essentially shows you the underexposed, the middle exposed, and then the overexposed pictures. And I'll show you how that looks with the actual images. I use the Sony A7R and A7S cameras, and you could choose a wide range, 9 frames, plus or minus 4 stops, including the middle exposures. So 4 on each side and the middle exposure, and you could get 9 frames. I could set it in 1 f-stop increment. So that's a pretty wide increment, and you need that to essentially get a very large corona, because the outer part of the corona is fairly dim. And so the way it shows up, if you were looking at the actual exposures, you'd start out, the first picture I would see would be, and first picture that the camera takes, it's minus 4 stops, underexposed, -3, -2, -0, and then there's a middle exposure. Then it goes overexposed by 1, 2 stops, 3 stops, and 4 stops. So the way this looks the pictures, this is 9 consecutive frames from my camera from 2017. So this is using the auto bracketing or the bracketing mode at plus or minus 4 f-stops. So I start out, the pictures I showed you at the partial and the diamond ring Bailey's bead area, those were all at 1/500th of a second. So if I left it at 1/500th, then it would underexpose, and the -4 would be 1/8000th of a second, which you don't really need, and then the +4 would only have been a 60th of a second, which really isn't that much. So what you have to do, this takes a little thinking through ahead of time, and the other thing is remembering how to do this during a pretty crucial time, is right as soon as the full eclipse happens, the corona appears, you have to change your base shutter speed to whatever the middle of those plus or minus 4 f-stops are. And for me, I start out 500th a second, so then my middle exposure becomes a 30th of a second. That's the 0 exposure in that -4 to +4 scale. So the camera knows that the middle exposure is now 30th. So the very first frame it takes, now the very first frame takes is a 500th of a second. That's the -4 stops. Then it goes to 2/50th of a second, 1/25th, 1/60th. So now it's going -3, -2, -1 stops, and then it takes 1/30th of a second. That's the 0. That's the center one, and then it goes to the overexposed side, 1/15th, 1/8th, 1/4th, and 1/2 of a second. So I was shooting 1/2 a second exposures with a telephoto lens on a tripod. So that's another reason you really need a remote release, wireless remote release, because then you're not touching the camera. And what this does, it'll get you a series of 9 different exposures. And if you're doing just a single frame, you could pick probably one of these, and you get a pretty nice big corona and a nice picture of the total eclipse sun. It does take a little. This is what, if you're going to do this method, this is something to really practice on, because the first thing you do is you change your shutter speed to the center one. If you're starting at 1/1000th of a second, for example, if the recommended the starting point that I talked about earlier, if you start at 1/1000th of a second, then your middle exposure would be 1/60th of a second. So then you got to slow your shutter speed to a 60th of a second. You have to turn on the auto bracketing. You got to know where that is. Once that's on, then all you need to do is press the button on your remote. I think the way I had it set, it was for single frame. So I press it 9 times. It goes through this sequence, and I did this 3 times during the eclipse. All the time while I'm pressing the button, I could be looking up and watching the eclipse. I just need to keep pressing the button as long as it goes through this whole sequence.
So Stan, if I may, this on the Sony camera, I thought the bracketing, it would shoot all these shots on its own. You hit it once and it would do all 9 shots. Is that not right?
There's a continuous mode and there's a single frame mode. I was using my Nikon D850, and they just had a single frame mode, but there is a continuous mode. And so, but again, practice with it, because there was one remote release I had that it didn't really activate the whole continuous sequence. It only did part of it. And so test your remote as well if you're going to use that. Make sure everything is working the way you really want it to work for the modes that you're in.
Yep.
And Grace, you have your hand up.
Yes, Stan, I have a question. All these bracketing, the speed is based on spot metering the sun, not the sky, right?
Yes, on the sun. And like I said, this is also based on the suggested starting point that I talked about earlier, which was at ISO 400. I start out at 1/1000th of a second at f8. on the settings on my camera. If I'm using a filter and just going out and trying to take pictures of sunspots or the sun. And so the example here that you see right now is based on that setting. I just, for the Eclipse, I was using 1/500th of a second at f11, which is the same exposure for the camera lens setup that I had. And so my starting point was 500th of a second, and so the middle exposure for the bracketing became 1/30th of a second.
Stan, I think Grace said something about based on the spot meter. This
Right.
this isn't metering at all. These
No.
are using these exposures in manual mode.
Yes, you have to be in manual mode to use this particular feature, and the spot meter is just to determine the exposure, because Grace and anybody else that had questions about exposure, once you determine a good exposure for the sun with your filter on, you'll want to switch. You want to be in the manual metering mode. You don't want to be in the automatic mode, because it could change the setting and you could get a pretty horrible looking picture, because with the filter on your camera, everything except the sun is totally black on the frame of your picture, and so that's not so good for your exposure. So what the bracketing mode is doing is that it's the camera is physically changing the shutter speed, which has nothing to do with the actual the metering, the light metering part.
Stan, Dave Gerard says, would you use mechanical shutter or electronic shutter?
Whichever you prefer. I don't think it. I guess whatever you're used to using. I'm not sure if there would be a real big difference. David Shepard.
Yeah, just a question on why did you choose the ISO of 400? Is there a specific reason or an advantage for going with that over something else?
Yeah, it retains the quality, and if I could shoot at a slower ISO, but then I'd have to shoot a slower shutter speed and maybe a wider f-stop. And with a long telephoto lens, trying to shoot the sun, it's good to have a relatively high shutter speed to start out with, 500th or even 1,000th of a second. And at ISO 400, I could get that combination of settings that usually works out pretty good. And really, if you have to go to 800 ISO, that's not going to be a big problem. Don't let that stop you getting a good picture. Especially if you've got a newer camera, the difference between 400 and 800 is not too huge. Don't go too slow though. Don't shoot at ISO 100, and then because if you look at this chart, my slowest shutter speed is 1/2 of a second if you're using this bracketing mode. If I'm shooting at a lower ISO, I might have to start out at say 2/50th or 125, and then all of a sudden I'm shooting a 1-second exposure at the very lowest, or even a 2-second exposure. And given the if there's any wind or anything like that, that could affect the picture of your totality. So definitely start out at the highest shutter speed that you can safely with good. It's kind of a balance between quality. ISO 400 still produces pretty good quality, and a good shutter speed and a good f-stop that'll make a good exposure.
Yeah, in 2017, I got a picture very similar to what you've got on the screen, between where it's +3 or +4 stops. And I had a Nikon D700. I had the ISO at 100. It was only about a 105 millimeter lens, so much shorter than what yours was. I was at f8 and I got like 0.6 seconds, because I was doing that same bracketing of changing things down. And so I got a decent shot at ISO 100, but I like your idea of starting with the higher shutter speed. So I'll probably go with the 400 this time.
Yeah, and again, unless you're going to make a giant poster from your picture, the difference between ISO 100 and 400 is not so huge that it's going to make a difference in the picture. If you're just going to look at it on your computer screen, it would be impossible to tell the difference. It really
Right.
would be.
Okay. Now it makes more sense. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. That's why I suggest starting at 400, and because it's a reasonable enough ISO that you'll still retain a pretty good amount of quality.
Yeah, because I'll probably have the camera on a tracking mount, you know, before, during, and after. So, you know, just trying to cut down on the things I have to do during totality.
Yeah,
So
the
this
main
is a good way to do that, I think, too.
right. The main thing you want to do is keep it as simple as possible so that you have less things to think about. The less things you have to think about, the more you have time to really enjoy the eclipse itself. If you look at this series of pictures, you might think, well, why am I shooting at a 500th and 250th of a second? You don't really get too much. Part of the reason I'm doing this is both to create a couple of single images that I could use for different purposes, but also there's a way that you could create a blend of images that does a lot of different that can show a lot of detail in the corona. And I posted on the chat. I think I titled the link "Corona Blend Information," and that leads you to a Vimeo video of an Adobe technician actually talking about how to do this. And you'll need Photoshop and Camera Raw to do this, and it's an interesting way to do it. But you need this whole series of pictures like this at different exposures, because what you need is something that shows a lot of detail in the corona. What these slow shutter speeds show is detail way out on the far edges of the corona. What the shorter shutter speeds show are the detail much closer to the sun. Prominences, you can actually see a couple prominences here, and a lot of the corona detail that's very close to the where the sun and the moon are. So you need this whole range of pictures to show that. Any questions? More questions about the bracketing, and I'll show you how the corona blend looks. You see any more questions about bracketing, Preston, or anything else?
Oh, you're good.
Okay, good. So if you do this blend properly, you get an image similar to this. You've probably seen a lot of different versions. People kind of go crazy sometimes with contrast and stuff. I try to minimize the contrast, but you see a lot of detail in the corona, both far away from the sun, but also relatively close, and you kind of see the different patterns that it makes. And this is what you could do with the 9 different frames. I mean, some people also shoot maybe like a third or 2/3 of an f-stop apart, so that just creates 2 or 3 times the amount of frames, because then now your difference in exposure is a lot less. This is sort of a balance between creating too many pictures and creating just enough to show you an interesting blend. And this isn't a dust spot. This is Regulus, the star Regulus, which showed up in a lot of pictures because the sky at that point is fairly dark, and you could start to see stars like that. And so the link that I sent you is a Vimeo link to the technician starts out with the instructions about how to do a blend like this, and then it's a part 1. That's part 1, and then the part 2 link is on the page with the part 1 video. So you'll see the part 2 link there on the page, and it's if you don't work too much in Photoshop, a lot of it might not make too much sense, but if you have worked a little bit, then it's kind of worth studying and sitting down. I actually wrote down the list of things. If you email me, I could send you that the written instructions, and then it might make a little bit more sense.
Stan, Marcy's asking, where is your link to the video on the blending method?
I think it's in the chat. I put a bunch of links right at the top of the chat right before we started, so it should be way at the top of the list of the chat, and it'll say, I think I put Corona blend instructions. I put a few websites about. I put Stellarium and Photographer's Ephemeris and some Eclipse planning websites. Right below that is the Corona blend instructions.
Giselle says no links visible.
I think you can only see things that were commented after you joined. So anything before that isn't visible to everyone.
Oh, okay, okay. After I finish here, I'll put the links on the chat. Sorry about that.
Ben asks, is this similar to stacking, which is normally used for deep sky objects?
Yeah, it's the same. It's the same principle. It's creating what's called a smart object in Photoshop, and then inserting it into Camera Raw to make a few adjustments to both the central moon, but also the corona itself. So it's taking the nine separate frames and then putting them all together, making a composite in Photoshop, and then adjusting brightness and contrast to get the effect that you want.
Marcy also asks, I noticed that you were shooting RAW and JPEG. Why JPEGs?
Oh, I think back then I needed some quick JPEGs to send out. I was working for the Agence France-Presse, the wire service that I used to work for. So I needed some fairly fast images to get out, and otherwise now I just shoot all RAW just because it's just easier that way.
Okay.
All right, and I think earlier I mentioned that you really don't want anything longer than about 500 or 550 millimeters for a full frame picture, for a full frame camera, and the tendency is, I think, oh, I want my 1,000 millimeter telescope or lens to get a really close up picture of the sun, and so if you do that, you kind of part of the eclipse, you'll probably get some pretty good pictures, but if you remember the 600 millimeter lens that I had in 2017, the image of the sun went through the frame in 7 minutes, and then I had to change. So the longer focal length you get, the bigger the image on your screen, but also the faster that image goes from the bottom left to out of your frame. So you have to be able to deal with that. So here's I did a simulation of if I was shooting this with a 1,000 millimeter lens. So here's the partial phase and the diamond ring. So you get this nice big sun, which looks great. Here's the single frame, and I think this is the 1/15th of a second exposure. So the corona is right at the very edge of this frame, and unless I have the sun and the moon centered exactly in the middle of the frame, I'm going to be losing part of the corona. And then if I do the auto bracketing and I want to do the corona blend, so this is 1,000 millimeters. All of a sudden now I've cut off the top and the bottom of the corona, because the corona at that time was quite large. And if you, I've been reading a little bit about how they determine how big coronas are, and it could be related to the activity of the sun. We're approaching solar maximum, and so the corona next April could be fairly large. And so you want to be able to, if you're going to do a blend like this, or even if you're going to get more of a picture with a single image with a lot of the corona, then you'll need plenty of space in your frame so that in case your sun isn't precisely centered, then you don't want to lose any of the corona in your pictures. So that's why I'm recommending. I'm probably going to shoot at around 500 millimeters or 550 at the very most, but definitely not at 600. I think that's too long of a focal length for the solar eclipse. Let's see. If there are many more picture questions, otherwise I could show you a couple of the planning.
No more picture
apps.
questions, but I did want to ask you, Stan, are you going to talk about using a tracking mount?
No, I wasn't going to, and because I think unless it's pretty large and sturdy and it can hold your camera lens or telescope, it's a lot to do. And I think if you've got a tracking mount, I'm sure you know how to use it pretty well. What kind of questions would you want to
Oh,
talk
well,
about?
I was just going to say, in 2017, I took the Ioptron,
Okay.
and with my, what was it, a Tamron 150 to 500 I think it is. And I was able to get that set up pretty well. What I did is I polar aligned it the night before. And then during the day, I leveled it, and I had a bearing on where I thought Polaris would be. And I just kind of made my best guess pointing to Polaris. And it worked pretty well through the, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours or whatever is the sequence. I had to adjust it every now and then, but it tracked pretty well.
Okay, yeah, that's one solution. One thing to remember though is I've talked about shooting essentially the entire eclipse from the beginning to the end, the partial phases and the total. You could just focus on just shooting the totality. Forget about the partial phases. You still need the filter on, so you can aim your camera, focus it, and get the exposure right. But then you could just shoot all your pictures during totality, and then put your cover on your camera after that, and enjoy the rest of the partial phases. And that really simplifies your work, and also your approach to the eclipse.
Hey, Stan.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Can I just make a quick, since we're talking about tracking mounts, just quickly.
Yeah.
And I just learned this very recently, actually. Actually, if you're going to be in Texas, and this might apply to other locations, there's actually a meridian flip about I think literally 5 minutes before before totality starts. And for anyone who doesn't know, meridian flip is when the imaginary line in the sky at the North Star, when an object crosses that line, your mount needs to flip over itself. Otherwise, it's going to crash into the tripod. So if you're using a tracking mount and you're going to be in Texas, make sure you have planned for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've gone to Photo Ephemeris, the photographer's ephemeris, which is a great planning tool. And the orange line is the sun, and the blue line is the moon. So they're almost matching up. The morning of April 8th in Fredericksburg, Texas. This is where I'll be. So 12:15 is first contact, and this is the pro version, so it actually shows you a little bit more than you might get in the free version. It shows you this nice graphic over here, and I think this is what Dan's talking about. So here we are through the partial phases, and as we get to totality, there's totality, and you can see the sun is almost at it's almost due south, and then I think this is what he's talking about, and so it's you're very close to the meridian there, and so that's I hadn't heard about that, but that's an interesting.
One thing, thank you, Dan, for putting that out. One thing you could do to mitigate is to program your mount to go over the meridian, but again, you need to test it because not all the mounts are equal.
Yeah, and what I'm thinking about doing is actually using, so I have a mount that can work in equatorial or azimuth mode. And so if you have an azimuth mount, it doesn't matter because you don't need a meridian flip. So if your tracker is azimuth and not equatorial, you'll be okay.
Yeah, another reason to really go out and practice with the equipment you have, and make sure that you're setting it up properly. Just a couple things about the actual planning. There's a couple websites that are pretty good. This is timeanddate.com, and you could zoom into this map, and then if you click on a point, it'll show you exactly what's happening at that point, where the eclipse begins, the maximum, where it ends, duration of totality, all of that. So that really gives you a lot of information. And the other one is this Xavier Joubier, and he's created a similar one where it shows you the entire path of the eclipse as it goes across from the Pacific to the Atlantic. Then you could just zoom in, and you could pick a point, and it'll give you the information about when it starts, also the altitude, the compass setting of the sun, and then the duration of totality. So all of this is pretty good information that'll help you. And
what's the URL for that? What is that called?
XGBA. I'll put the link on the chat.
Thanks.
And in Stellarium is actually pretty good as well to do some planning. If let's see, I think, where are we? So I said this is for Buffalo, New York, for those that might be in upstate New York. And so this is approaching totality. And if you do the simulation, all of a sudden, so this is in the middle of the full eclipse. Sun and the moon are here. You see Jupiter, Venus, Saturn, and Mars. So if you've got a pretty wide angle lens, you could get the ecliptic right there. And so to me, that'd be an amazing picture from upstate New York. You see this line of the planets, the sun, and the moon all at the same time. And so this is Jupiter and Venus, I would think, would be fairly easy to get in a wide picture. Saturn and Mars might be a little more dim, but I would think they would show up. So definitely worth a try. And Dan, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the automated apps that might be useful?
Yeah, sure.
Hang on, let me.
Yeah, I have my program open if I can share it.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple different softwares out there for automating the eclipse, automating your photography of the eclipse, by which I just mean the software will, if you have it programmed correctly, do all of this for you, at least as far as taking the pictures. I mean, you'll still have to remove the filter yourself. You'll still have to center the sun and everything yourself. But for capturing all the different phases, including the Bailey's beads, the diamond rings, and the corona, like getting like what Stan was talking about, getting those composite images of the corona, different exposure lengths, the program can do all of that for you. And so I mean, I've kind of embarrassingly only started digging into this very recently, but this program I have open here is called Set and See. It's a freeware. I know it's compatible with Windows. I think it might be compatible with Mac. I know the popular Mac software is called Solar Eclipse Maestro, and that's a freeware as well. There's Eclipse Orchestrator for Windows that I think costs like $100. So there's a couple different options. This one's on the older side, as you can see. I think the last release was in 2011. I don't know why it hasn't been updated since then. But it's, kind of old school looking. I've only started playing with it very recently, but it seems pretty good. So this main window here with all the different times, you can pick the eclipse. So obviously we're going to be in the April 8th eclipse, so you can just use these keys to scroll to that one. And then possibly the most important thing to keep in mind with these is if you want to get precise, capture each phase at the precise time, your computer's time is not going to be fully accurate. You really need like very precise time. Your time needs to be set very precisely. And so what this program is doing is just taking a delta t of the time. So it's calculating the delay between the real time and my computer's time to be 71 seconds. And so it's going to offset, 71 seconds. So it's going to offset that by that much. And you can set it manually as well. And then you can just put in your location right here, the latitude and longitude. Obviously you have to find that out ahead of time. As far as, so you connect your camera here. I just have my 6D connected, no lens connected to it. But you could set the quality and everything just like you would do. This screen is basically just for testing it, making sure it works. So, I can click release, and I think my camera's actually not on. But anyway, it'll do that. And then this, I have to redo my screen share to get this other screen up. Hold on.
So is it triggering the shutter for you?
Yeah, yeah. So what it does to get the phases is creates this exposure table, which is the screen on the left here. And again, you have to set your image quality to raw, and then I'll just set my ISO to 400. Again, I don't have a lens connected, so there's no F number. But I think if you have a lens connected, you could set the F number. And then it just says 3 settings right here. It seems pretty simple. So if I set it to take pictures of the partial phases every 9 minutes, I could do that, or more frequently if I want. And then this just does between second and third contact, how many pictures for Bailey's beads you want to take. So maybe I should just create the exposure table to show you, give you a better idea. And then up here, this is the different exposure lengths. So it's gonna, so for the partial phases here, it's gonna take 1 1,000th, 1 500th, and 1 250. And it's just gonna do this, you know, a couple different times leading up, and then it gives you a warning to remove filters right before the totality starts. And then you can customize all this. So if I don't want to take a ton of pictures of the partial phases, I could just delete these, which I might do because I don't want to be, you know, taking up a ton of space on the card, and I don't care that much about the partial phases. And then, you know, you can change these. So if you want to take you need to take a shorter exposure for Bailey's beads, just click that, and you could take both. You know, you could take many different exposures. So this all seems pretty nicely customizable. And then the thing I like about it most is during maximum eclipse, it'll allow you to loop different exposure lengths during the full length of totality. So it'll take between 1 1,000th and 4 seconds, and it'll just keep doing that for as long as totality lasts. So then you have a whole bunch of pictures, and you don't have to do anything with your camera while this is happening. This does it all on its own. So once you start, and then the screen down here, you know, you just click this start Eclipse photography, and it'll just do this. You could literally start this like 2 hours before the eclipse, and then it'll just, by the time of totality, you won't even have to look back at your computer. I mean, you'll have to look back to refocus maybe, but you know, you're not going to be playing with your camera at all during totality. So you know, you could look through binoculars or whatever, do whatever you want without having to fiddle with your camera. So that's what's appealing about it to me. And I also like that it just does all this bracketing for you. So you don't even really have to set any settings in the camera at all other than your ISO. You know, we're making sure you're in single shoot mode.
I may have missed this, but the camera's on a tracker.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it doesn't really matter all that much. I mean, I guess it matters to the extent that you want to make sure you're not having to move the tripod, you know, during totality or right before it. But yeah, I mean, technically it doesn't really matter if the mount's on a tracker or not. And let me see if I can run. So it allows you to run a test, actually. Let me see if it'll work. Yeah, so you can see, I don't know if you can hear my shutter clicking. It's clicking the shutter. And yeah, it gives you this warning to remove filters.
Yeah.
And then it's going to start. Yeah. I mean, obviously you would want to make sure you have a speaker on if you want to hear this alert, you'll have to make sure you have a speaker on your computer. But yeah, that's pretty much it as far as this software. Like I said, I haven't tested the others. I don't know really anything about them. And I kind of just started playing with this one very recently, but I mean, it already seems like it basically works. So this is probably what I'll be using. Another thing, you know, an important thing about using a computer is, like we've been saying, you know, test everything ahead of time. Make sure all the connections work. I just found out today, I tried to connect my Canon camera to my laptop, and the USB port is completely faulty and will just disconnect the camera. So you know, make sure your USB connections work, that they're stable and everything. You know, if you do deep sky imaging, or if you use a computer otherwise for your photography, just take that computer with you. That's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to take the computer that I always use because I know it works. So
this is for Canon cameras, right? Right, Dan?
This works for Canon and Nikon, I know. I think it might work for Sony as well. I think, yeah, I know pretty much all Canon cameras are supported. I think most Nikons are supported. But I'm not sure about Sony and the other brands.
Yeah, they make some pretty good software, Canon, for Astro.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I mean, Canon seems like a safe bet because it seems like everything's supported.
Well, Dan, the memory cards are so cheap now. To me, you might as well just keep everything because to get a 64 gig or 128 gig card isn't very expensive, and then you'll have all the bigger.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, I guess my concern was more. I mean, I'm probably gonna be using a dummy battery for power. But I remember in 2017, I was just like taking pictures of the partial phases like it was nothing, and then actually, I think like 5 or 10 minutes after totality, my battery just died, and I was like, wow, I dodged a bullet there because I couldn't have imagined if it died during totality. But
Oh yeah, the one thing I forgot to mention, I forgot to put in my notes, is that if you don't have a spare battery, get one right now, and get two, in fact. And that if you're taking a lot of pictures during the partial phase, or if you look down at your camera 10 minutes before totality and you're at about 50% of power, replace the battery right away with a fully charged battery, because you don't want to have anxiety like Dan might have had, where you got a low charge and you're in the middle of the full eclipse. So have at least one extra battery with you, and have an extra completely empty memory card with you too, because you don't want it to run out of space on any of your memory cards.
It looks like Gary's got his hand up.
Gary's in the house.
Maybe not.
Maybe
Watch out. Watch out.
Well, thanks, Dan.
Sure.
That's kind of wild that you could program all that stuff, and then of course you obviously do need your computer with you to plug the camera.
And I've been reading that people notice their computer doesn't do well, in the heat under sunlight. So make sure you have something to protect your computer during the sun.
Yeah, and then also I'm sure people will remember this, but or maybe make a list. Make sure to have a hat and sunscreen, because you're going to be standing out. Well, you hope you'll be standing out in the sun for quite a while, because that just means it'll be clear where you are, and make sure that you're protected as well, just in terms of overheating, things like that. Depending on
lawn chairs are good. Lawn chairs are
good. Yeah.
Cold beverage.